It is generally believed that the global process of decolonization was initiated by the policies of the United States and the USSR during and immediately after World War II. But was it only communist ideology and the American thirst for profit that caused the collapse of the colonial system? The Americans absolutely rightly believed that European colonial empires restricted free trade by establishing advantages for the metropolises. The U.S. had long wanted free access to the markets of the colonies. And to do so, it had to destroy the colonial system that had been in place for centuries. But before we begin, subscribe to our channel, like and share this video on social media. Next, we will tell you the real reasons for the collapse of the British Empire and what role the Japanese played in this story. By the beginning of the 20th century, the United States had already developed ideas that later grew into the practice of neocolonialism. There is no need to take over an underdeveloped country and keep civil administration and military forces there. It is much more profitable to give such a country independence, let them solve their own internal problems. At the same time, such a country will always have a very weak industry, so American goods will always find markets there. And we will have to pay for it with raw materials, the extraction and export of which will be in the hands of good supporters of freedom and democracy Americans. To put it quite simply, the transition to the new policy meant a simple offer made to all the old colonial powers. Give your colonies to us. We won't fly our flag there, of course, but all the money that used to go to London, Paris, Amsterdam and Brussels will now go to New York. The situation at the beginning of World War II seemed to work in the American interest. France, the Netherlands and Belgium had fallen to the Wehrmacht, and their colonies as well as much of Britain's holdings in Asia had been overrun by Japan. That left Great Britain. This country continued to fight stubbornly with the Germans and despite the losses to hold on to a privileged status in relations with the colonies and dominions. Then the Americans put forward the main condition for entering the war with Germany, the post-war liberation of the colonies. U.S. President Roosevelt appeared before British Prime Minister Churchill as a real brigand who took advantage of the moment of weakness of the empire. The head of the British cabinet refused to even talk about the possibility of breaking colonial ties. But Roosevelt understood perfectly well. American aid is too necessary for the British. After the first unsuccessful negotiations, the president said, "We will talk more thoroughly about India before we exhaust the subject. And Burma, and Java, and Indochina, and Indonesia, and all the African colonies, and Egypt and Palestine. We will talk about all these things." The result of long negotiations, disputes and conflicts was the signing in August 1941 of the Atlantic Charter, a declaration describing the picture of the post-war world through the eyes of the leaders of the anti-Hitler coalition. Among the general statements in the style of, "We are for all good things," there was an inconspicuous fourth paragraph, which read, "The Allies will endeavor to secure a situation in which all countries, great or small, victorious or vanquished, will have access on an equal footing to trade and to the world's raw materials necessary for the economic prosperity of these countries." Despite the highly veiled language, which made no mention of the dissolution of colonial empires, this clause meant one thing: the U.S. would seek the dismantling of the metropolis system of trade advantages. Consequently, the Americans are moving to a new policy at the global level. In general, it was the Americans who buried the world colonial system. In August 41, Roosevelt and Churchill signed the Atlantic Charter, which defined the principles of building the world after the victory. Clause 3 stated, "The right of nations to choose their own form of government, restoring the sovereign rights and self-government of those peoples who had been deprived thereof by force." The Americans had no colonies, so it was easy for us to talk about the right of nations to choose their form of government. The British, on the other hand, had no choice. Without American help, they would have been in a very tight spot. But anyway, the British kept their promise and gave all their colonies independence. So, the states were left with no competitors. The independence of the British colonies stimulated the growth of national liberation movements throughout Africa and Asia. Within 2 decades, the vast majority of the colonies became independent states. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? From my point of view, bad. Regimes came to power there, compared to which the European colonizers were mere lambs of God. In my opinion, the people of these colonies should have fought for their rights within the framework of autonomies and federations with the historical metropolises, as it was the departure of the colonizers set most of the new countries back many decades. America had not yet entered the war but had already laid claim to a key role in the post-war world. By 1941, a major war had already been going on in the East for several years. The Japanese Empire had fought China quite successfully and was about to take control of its vast human and natural resources. In 1940, under pressure from the Japanese, Vichy France gave the samurai control of French Indochina. And in December, Japan's aircraft carrier fleet attacked Pearl Harbor, giving rise to the rapid occupation of most of the colonial possessions from the Philippines to Burma. However, it was the 20th century. It was considered unseemly to simply seize a dozen states and possessions. Any conquests had to be explained with beautiful words. For this purpose, the Japanese invented the ideology of the Great East Asian Sphere of Co-Prosperity. They declared, "Europeans have nothing to do in Asia. The power over the former colonies must pass into the hands of Asians." Naturally, this required the help of the Japanese army, which would bring freedom to the oppressed peoples with its bayonets. For liberation there was a reward: all Asian countries had to join the sphere of co-prosperity, which in reality turned out to be nothing but another form of colonialism. Only instead of free trade, taking advantage of the wartime emergency situation, the Japanese preferred to simply export goods and raw materials of interest to them. Having invented the sphere of co-prosperity, the Japanese found themselves in an uncomfortable situation. From now on any territory liberated from the Europeans, they had to start creating independent nation-states. The Allies won victory after victory, and the promises had to be converted into deeds. All East Asian countries were independent states with their own officials, militaries, and ruling class until they were incorporated into the European colonial empires. The European conquest did not bring fundamental changes. All colonial powers used already existing systems of power. The main goal of local elites was independence. Therefore, politicians and intellectuals demanded from the Japanese self-government, their own armies and police forces, representative bodies of government, and the ability to create national political parties. The Japanese authorities seemed willing to give nothing. But Japan's ability to effectively control the vast possessions dumped on its head was severely limited. Without reliance on local forces, it was decisively impossible to retain power in the colonies. The first thing the Japanese did was to involve in their projects the leaders of independence movements, who had been persecuted or even imprisoned under the previous authorities. The samurai expected that in gratitude, local patriots would faithfully serve the country of the rising sun. The Sukarno in Indonesia, the Ba Ma in Burma willingly defected to the victor's side. It did not matter to them who they worked with. The main thing was that by receiving at least a small share of power from the Japanese occupiers, they were bringing the liberation of their countries closer. Sukarno, despite his cooperation with the Japanese, turned out to be the first president of Indonesia. And Ba Ma, although he had the reputation of a Japanese lackey, remained in history as the first head of independent Burma. Even Indian collaborators led by Subhash Chandra Bose are real heroes of the independence struggle for Hindus. The Japanese gradually made more and more concessions. First of all, they had to agree to the creation of local troops. The Mikado's army did not have enough soldiers to patch up the holes forming at the front. So, they decided to shift some of the burdens of military service to the liberated peoples. In 1943, the Indian and Indonesian national armies appeared. In Burma, since 1941, there were still active detachments of supporters of independence, which were trained and armed by the Japanese before the war with Britain. In 1942, these formations became the core of the Burmese army. The Japanese diligently created local political parties. In words, they were for the unity of the yellow race, but in reality, they hated the invaders and only waited for the hour when they could throw them into the sea. We had to come to an agreement with the locals, also in the field of economy. In order to collect taxes, organize the sending of volunteer workers to Japan and establish the economy, the Japanese puppets needed real power. And the further they went, the more they got them. By the end of the war, it was not quite clear who benefited more from the policy of concessions: the Japanese, who ensured loyalty in the occupied territories, or the local elites, who received from the new masters a lot of military orders and loans for modernization of production. In extremely difficult military conditions, the Japanese government openly bribed the leaders of the countries of the sphere of co-prosperity, giving them the funds and resources that Japan needed. Of course, for the ordinary people of East Asia, the Japanese occupation cost enormous sacrifices. But once given, freedom could not be taken away. Despite attempts to save the colonial possessions, despite the wars of independence that continued for many years after the victory over Nazism, the fate of the East Asian colonies was obvious even to the most hard-headed imperialists. So, the Second World War and the policy of two bitter enemies, the USA and Japan, caused the collapse of the ancient colonial system, which seemed unshakable a few decades ago, and the fact that today the economies of the USA and Japan are simply many times superior to the economy of Britain is nothing to talk about. Guys, if you liked our video, but you haven't subscribed to us yet, subscribe right now and post the video in social networks. There will be a lot of interesting things in the next episodes. See you soon. Bye.